Thank you. And Melissa and I had discussed a few minutes ago the idea of leaving the thermal and buildings to the end, since it may be that that's the area where we'll have the most discussion. Is that okay with you, Joey? Then can we begin with transportation? And is it possible, Liz, to scroll through the slides from the top?
I thought we were starting with electricity.
Oh, okay. That's
So,
good.
Oh, that's what's on the agenda.
yeah, we had a request from the electric task group. TJ was hoping to have that go second, but if transportation can go first, that would accommodate, but if you can't, we'll stick with the original.
We can do it. We can do it. It's just, that's what the agenda says.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gina, you're right.
All right, Gina and Joey, I think you're up.
Sure. Yeah, apologies for being a few minutes late. And apologies for not being 100% clear about most effective and efficient way to roll through this. But I mean, fundamentally, as we shared at our last cross-sector meeting, I mean, the recommendations and the transportation component of the climate action plan, what we're putting forward is not radically different than what we put forward in the adopted climate action plan. We've organized it a little differently. There are some newish concepts, nothing particularly earth-shattering, but just really a significant focus organized under 4 pathways, with the first pathway, as you see here, being what we see as an enabling pathway, setting the sort of glide path for stepped pollution emissions reductions, as well as raising a more sustainable, consistent revenue source. And that is, again, adopting a cap and invest policy, including but not limited to transportation, per the conversation we're going to have on thermal. And again, that being a little exactly what that means, a bit unclear as we wait for the work underway to undertake an analysis led by ANR VTrans and the treasurer to look at this very question and like how Vermont, could potentially participate in such a program, what that means, cost benefits, administrative components, et cetera. So that is pathway 1. And as people recall, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a cap and invest, regional cap and invest policy that Vermont spent over a decade looking into, was under each pathway in the adopted climate action plan. We just pulled it out to say, we need something along these lines as enabling fundamentally to most everything else. So that's pathway 1. Pathway 2 was we collapsed the 2021's climate action plans, pathway 1 and pathway 2, that was about light duty vehicles and pathway 1 and heavy duty vehicles into pathway 2, and collapsed all of that into just reducing emissions from vehicles writ large. And we shared with you via the Excel document more specificity around that. But as you will see, when we get to in our 4 sort of big buckets, this is a lot about, sort of aiming to maintain and potentially defend our participation in the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks program under the waiver of California as authorized currently by the federal government. And then sort of raising long-term consistent revenue source for things like electric vehicles, equity and climate programs like Mileage Smart, that sort of thing. So there's a whole bucket of things under this pathway. And then if we want to go to the next slide, the 3rd pathway, then I'm going to turn it over to Gina and Andrea to talk about reduction in vehicle miles traveled, is just sort of pathway 3, which is really just one recommended strategy. And it again is premised upon, you know, understanding the results of the analysis underway to look at decarbonizing transportation and beyond, which is potentially considering a complementary clean fuel standard to lower the carbon intensity of fuels. So this is about the fuels, you know, inside of the vehicle as opposed to the vehicles themselves. So those are the three big buckets. Then there's the VMT, vehicle miles traveled strategies, which is really more about land use, again, enabling to fundamentally provide options to Vermonters to get out of their vehicles, to get where they need to go, which obviously not using a vehicle is the most, you know, energy efficient, cost effective strategy for the most part we can do. So then we have just the four sort of synthesized strategies. I don't know if Andrea or Gina want to say anything more about pathway 4, or if we want to dig into the Excel document.
Well, I would
dig into the Excel
say-
document. I think you want to dig into the high priority actions is where you
okay.
want to spend time. Yeah.
I would add to Joey's overview that 4 is also about improving state, regional, and local planning around where we invest in alternative modes in transit and in bike ped, so that we can get the best bang for the buck. Also, electrifying transit vehicles is critical to help make that mode more emissions cost effective. That's a big part of that. So there's a planning component for VTrans, and then also municipalities, because that's where the land use is being decided. So we need to make sure that there's robust transportation. Just something we talked about last time. 2 important factors I've already explained last week, or did, that there that the trans undertook last was a carbon reduction assessed emissions benefits or not of various funding programs. And then
your audio is pretty bad today. I don't know quite what's going on, but it's hard to hear you.
it's probably
Maybe shut off your video, Gina.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just was your
It's my earpods.
Oh, yeah, it is.
there you go.
Sorry, did you hear me?
A little bit. So much
Some of
better
it.
now.
Every other word. I essentially said what Joey didn't mention is that there's robust planning around where we invest at the state, regional, and local level, because at the local level, that's where the land use decisions are being made. And this is investing in things like bike ped and transit, because there is this important land use connection. And we talk about land use connection. We're coordinating with the group that's the intersector group working on land use to try to make sure that what we're saying and what they're saying are the same thing in terms of land use strategies and actions. Yeah, and then did you hear me say that there are 2 studies that VTrans has undertaken since we did the last plan? That is the carbon reduction strategy, which really shows through some very sophisticated modeling the emissions benefits of transit, of the various VTrans programs. It's framed within VTrans programs, transit funding, bike ped funding, and what the emissions benefits are or not of those programs as they exist today, and how much they would need to be increased if we were to try to make a dent in emissions. The second study is the smart growth study that VTrans undertook, which we asked for in the last plan, which assessed the emissions benefits of concentrated mixed use development as opposed to rural sprawl. And that found that there was benefits by 2050 of future growth being in downtowns and village centers as opposed to out on the countryside. So it was good to have that that modeling exercise. So
Great.
those are the 2 things. Those studies greatly informed what you're going to see in the big spreadsheet, and it's not hugely different from what we talked about last time around.
Thanks. I'd strongly encourage you all to jump right into those priority actions because we're moving quickly today to get through everything.
Yeah. I don't know who's giving the presentation for the Climate Council, if that's going to be just the co-chairs or how that's going to work, but probably would be valuable if we just provide like 1 or 2 bullets about what those pathways really mean in the action sense, like, so you can be concise about it and move on. Would that be helpful?
That'd be very helpful. I assume it's me and Rich doing that presentation on Monday.
Yeah.
And are those
Right.
2 bullets, are these not the bullets in front of us that we'd want to put forward?
I mean, do you want to walk through those past slides and just say there's this, I mean, just read like there's 5 strategies and 15 actions, or do you want to say one sentence about what that really means action wise? I don't know if we're going to get to this later.
I would encourage for the council presentations that you would give a sentence, and it doesn't even need to be on the slide, but you're ready verbally to do a sentence or 2 to say, kind of like what Joey and Gina did, but I would tighten it up a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I would,
That's what you want, but just a touch tighter, but exactly that kind of content is right.
Yep. I think we could be very helpful to Melissa and Rich to provide those bullets so that they don't have to like go back and watch videos.
We can do that. We can do that.
And I do have a question though. And maybe I'm missing it. Just a minute ago, one of the top priorities was consider a clean fuel standard. And it's pathway 3, lower the carbon intensity of fuels. And
That's not a top priority. It's, I don't think we should include the language on the slide.
Okay, so right here, the pathway 3 is not one of the top priorities, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, these slides are just saying what is in the total recommendations, and then the next slide is the priorities, right?
Yeah, and it's the priorities that are going to get presented to the Climate Council.
Correct.
Well, it's these slides too, but yes,
Okay.
I would take that language out.
This is part of the challenge that we've had with this exercise is short of writing a very, very long sentence for each priority that covers everything, which we didn't think is what they needed. We had to, through making things concise, cut things out that when you actually look at what we're recommending are very much there, if you will. It's hard.
Right. But these slides, my recommendation is not to get into that kind of content like what's in pathway 3, right? I'd recommend taking out that's just to be consistent with the other ways and allows you to move a little bit more expeditiously, like quickly into where we were just jumping into, which are the priority actions. But I think the content you're providing was great verbally. I would do it shorter, but that kind of content, and then get into your priority actions, say, and by the way, council, these are like the really, really the things we most want to call your attention to.
I mean,
Exactly.
David, can you go back to the priority slide? Because the first action assumes we will have the results of the cap and invest policy, which may tell us various things about complementary policies that will be necessary to get to cap and invest.
Right, and that's
get to
the
our
narrative that
goal.
goes with that bullet, and then you move on to the next bullet.
Right. Okay. So we will say that, Rich,
Oh, for sure.
in these
I
complementary
hope you
policies.
do.
Complementary policies include including all fuels, a clean standard, a clean energy standard. So it'll be there. It's just not written down. It'll be in the presentation.
So
We could say adopt a cap and invest in other complementary policies.
Well, that's too broad for a priority
It's
action.
not.
That'd be like to do everything.
I know.
Right.
Well, we want to do everything.
It's a little much.
I know.
Well,
but that's what's got to happen.
No, I think what needs to happen is we just provide literally one sentence per pathway, one sentence per bullet here for their talking points, and then it's done.
the one thing that was not discussed just a few minutes ago was this 4th bullet, priority action, regional partnerships and
Yes.
collaboration with other states.
Yes.
So on the one hand, the clean fuel standards missing, not one of the 4. And this fourth bullet is one of the four. So what's that about?
Well, one can't happen without four because we're talking about a regional or multi-state cap and invest.
Right.
So we have to have that there. It's embedded in one. I suppose you could say we could get rid of it for now, but then we would have to maybe, I think there's too many words in one right now. All we need to say is adopt a cap and invest and complementary policies to reduce emissions. For the purposes of the presentation, this will include partnerships with other states.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I agree with you. It's embedded in one, and therefore it might not be needed. And
Right.
but I would also say that I think if we're talking about cap and invest, we also need to talk about the invest side of it. So emphasizing that it creates a sustainable revenue source is
Okay, so that's
seems
that
to
part
me
of the
kind of,
sentence
yeah, an
needs to
important
stay.
highlight. So I would leave it in.
Okay.
So can I help
Who's
tease
handling the
out?
next, who's handling the next edit? Will the A&R, will the chairs be handling the edits that we're talking about right now?
I think functionally that may have to happen, right, Rich? We have some time set up tomorrow to like finalize the presentation to the council.
Yeah, and I'm personally happy to invite the task group leads to send us your suggestions.
Okay.
But
So at this point, are we talking about moving for the fourth bullet away because it's embedded under one? And I did have a question on this slide, just that bullet 2 does seem like it's a handful of actions, or at least 2. And I don't know how rigid we're gonna be about specific actions. And David, maybe, I don't know if the council has guidance on that, but would you rather have a few more bullets that are actually discrete? Like this is, in the overall workbook, this is at least 2 or 3 actions combined into one. Like defending the advanced clean cars role is very different than promoting incentives for EVs.
Yeah, I think it's okay. If you want to split them up, it'd be great. If you don't, that's okay too. The council will figure it out, right? We're just trying to get it sort of more or less to a certain number of things that people can wrap their minds around as the most highest priority things. So I think there's a little flexibility right now in how to do that. Could I just quickly test what's going on in terms of the edits? Because I think I want to be super efficient with you all in terms of edits. So what I'm hearing in edits is, in the previous slides, take out that detail that's in pathway 3. However, write yourself some talking points that are along the lines what Joey and Gina did, right? 2, you're kind of on the fence, but it seems like you may not want that fourth bullet as standalone because it's kind of embedded in the top. You should make a call about that. And then 3, Rich is asking, should the clean fuel standard be one of your priority actions? So those are sort of what I'm hearing in the conversation that needs to happen. It sounds like is what to do with that fourth bullet. Leave it, don't leave it. Clean fuel standard, should it be up in these priority actions? That's what I've heard so far. There may be more. But I don't want to lose those things to go on to something new. So to resolve the fourth bullet and resolve the issue of clean fuels, quick thoughts on that? Joey?
I mean, I guess I don't really feel strongly about the fourth one. I think it is encompassed in the first priority, but I think there are other regional partnerships and potential collaborations, like through either with NESCOM or US Climate Alliance states. Like, I don't want to cut us off, but that work is happening already, but we want to make sure that we continue to participate and support that work. So I don't feel strongly about that. As it relates to a clean fuel standard, Rich, I mean, I think, as Gina said, we're going to wait for the results of this upcoming analysis. You know, we're sort of struggling here because we're trying to make recommendations and prioritize, lacking some pivotal information. So I'm hoping that this is our first best foot forward, and that, you know, the first 3 in particular are core. I get that in bullet number 2 that there's a little bit of creative smudging, but It's really all in the electrification space, as you so artfully sort of distilled last time, David. So I guess I don't feel very strongly. I think trying to be as clear as possible. Again, for clarity's sake, what we're recommending here is not radically different than what we adopted in 2021 because we continue to lack a primary regulatory or policy tool largely.
Okay.
So,
That's helpful. Rich, any thoughts on the clean fuel standard? Maybe it gets in there, but with an asterisk, like waiting for results of upcoming analysis to, really lean into that. What do you think, Rich?
Okay, so here's what I am hearing, that the fourth bullet could be removed. And we can note that a cap and invest policy is only going to happen in conjunction with other states. We're not going to go it alone, and we've not discussed going it alone here or for thermal. I would break up the second bullet, electrification, into at least two. One is availability, accessibility, and affordability through various techniques. That's sort of making them available. And Clean Cars 2 is making them, a regulatory requirement. So those are quite different. And I would break that second bullet into two.
Okay.
And have a sub bullet. And then the third bullet could stay as it is. The fourth one could go, and we end up still with 4 bullets. And I get it that we're not recommending as one of our top priorities going forward with the clean fuel standard, because we are instead recommending a cap and invest as our first choice. And that makes sense to me.
Rich, would it be okay to say adopt a cap and invest and necessary complementary policies? And then you could have a footnote saying such as. Clean.
But Gina, aren't the complementary policies the subsequent bullets?
No. Well, the way the study, and those of you who are involved with it, please clarify. The way the study's coming out is that cap and invest for transportation alone won't get us there. I don't want to break the news. They're still notching the numbers, but you have to have more fuels involved in order for us to get to our emissions reductions. And they're looking at complementary policies such as a standard. That's what's going on in California, and I don't know where New York is, but in order to achieve the emissions reductions we need, cap and invest alone may not do it. And Andrea and Joey, who are way more involved in this than I am, please chime in.
Can I make that big number 1 bullet have 2 sub bullets, which says in conjunction with other states and complementary policies such as a clean fuel standard?
Yeah, that's where I'm
Okay.
heading.
So we'll have 2 sub bullets under that bullet, and we have 4 bullets.
Yes.
I don't want to rush us, but I'm also feeling like we're down to the wire.
I was a big advocate of number 4 as it stands now, because we have to lead in those partnerships if we're going to achieve the cap and invest policy for Vermont. We have to not just go to a meeting. We need to be taking leadership roles to make it happen. But that can be in the description. It doesn't need to be there anymore. And so I agree. Let's take it out. But people need to know that that's not just a minor thing if we're going to achieve number 1.
Cap and invest has 2 sub bullets, one around regional coordination and one around complementary policies. Second bullet is broken up into 2, or somehow pull those 2 ideas apart. Fourth bullet is now up in the first and it's eliminated. And I didn't quite catch how we landed on clean fuel standards. That just we just let that be for now and don't.
It's a second bullet under the first cap and invest.
That's what complementary policies is sort of alluding to. Okay.
Yes.
And
got it.
And Gina pointed out that may include a clean fuel standard.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you could add that too.
Such as, you can do a such as.
Such as,
Yeah, I think Melissa had that. Yep.
Got it. Okay. Anything else? Sorry to rush, but anything else?
Looks good.
Nice.
I mean, just really quickly, David, sorry, we had talked a little bit, the words are not reflected on the page that would speak to like the how this happens. Like a cap and invest policy needs both likely rulemaking and some legislative action, but those words are not showing up on the page, but we are cognizant of that and would want to make sure that at some point when we are clear that we are speaking to the how in the recommendation.
Particularly as it relates to rulemaking because of the council's role in kicking off rulemaking.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about who are the obligated, who are the responsible entities, how this would functionally happen. I don't know if that is this moment. I'm assuming that this is still, again, first foot forward with the Climate Council, and there will be an opportunity to get into that more critical level of detail.
Well, there's
Right,
something-
particularly as the study's done in February. So maybe this is where the caveat is important verbally to do. Maybe there's something on the slide that caveats that, but I think that caveat of like, hey, there's still a lot of conversation going on around cap and invest that's going to roll right into February.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but all of these have to have a how. Who does it? How do we pay for it? Where does it happen? I mean, I just assume there'd be a narrative, not now, but if the Climate Council wants to go ahead with these priorities, then we got to do the hard work of the narrative that explains what Joey was just saying. Or am I missing something?
I think there's going to be a reckoning at the council how much detail to put in the plan and how much is left to the implementers.
Okay.
But yes, there is a narrative, Gina, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Are we okay to move on electricity?
Yes, please.
All right, let's do it. Liz Miller, are you up?
I don't know. I think somehow by default, it's always me, and it doesn't need to be. So I prefer to another person on the task group. I'm sure there's others on. We put this together this week as requested, and having reviewed the minutes of last week's meeting and my own memory of it, I think it's responsive to what we talked about last week. So if anyone else is interested in leading us through, that'd be great. But if
Can I
not,
just check, Liz Miller, how many slides like this do you have? Because this is definitely more detail than say.
this is it.
It's one slide.
Yep, we did it on one slide, and we have not done so. And I said that I would try this week, but bluntly, I haven't had time, and the rest of the group, I don't think, took it up. Updating the actual larger spreadsheet. So this is what we have.
Cool. Okay.
And these are the priorities. In other words, we reordered, we reframed, reordered, and narrowed what was in the longer list based upon what we talked about last week and the task group. I can't see who's on screen. Does anyone else want to present this or no?
Anyone want to help out with Liz on who's doing this work?
Liz, I am so happy to let you do it.
Okay, so we talked last week about the three pathways that had existed in the last plan, roughly speaking, reducing emissions from the electric sector, enabling Vermonters to electrify, and supporting load management and grid stability and strength. We agreed, I think, just consensus-wise anyway, last week, that reordering those and refocusing them, especially in light of the work already done on emissions reductions directly in the electric sector, made sense. So I think it was Melissa maybe who had said, gosh, maybe there should just be one priority of making sure the electric system is strong and affordable for Vermonters. We took that idea, and although it's not quite as specific and narrow as maybe Melissa had framed it, we did reprioritize to keep that as the first and highest priority pathway. And then under that, realized that a lot of the strategies we had in the prior draft, or the prior plan rather, fit, such as cost-effective load management and grid hardening and optimization. That is largely already occurring. And so again, this is highlighting that this work needs to continue, as you'll see through the action there. And I won't read it all because you can read it yourself, but it includes utility load management programs and investments, as well as rate design, and regulatory approval improvements that may be able to happen regarding efficient generation and infrastructure siting, which we've heard from a number of different avenues, including, I think, in public comment. Moving to the second one, this largely sounds like the pathway we had before, but highlights the work that's happened since then and the focus that needs to happen going forward. That's deploying programs to ensure that the electric grid's ready to support customer electrification. In looking through the other slides for the other groups, I still think that the way we've done our work here is understandable and that we've kind of atomized by topic area. But really, if we could, we should be truly cross-sectoring this stuff, because I believe, and I think others on our task group recognize, that this second pathway is reflected already in some of what transportation and building thermal has and what we're looking at today. And that includes the importance of cost effectiveness and equity in the actual design and implementation of the programs. Many programs to date have just been sort of first come, first serve available, or to the extent they've been low income qualified, there's been, I think, widely considered harder to get signups and adoption than perhaps we'd like going forward. So just keeping that in mind as we develop programs is important. And that again is a continued PUC oversight. We don't see, at least in the task group, didn't see a specific targeted need for legislative action there. It's really deepening what exists. And then finally, increased access and participation in renewable energy programs. This is an outgrowth of the prior priority on reducing emissions in the electric sector, but what this is designed to do is to focus on the fact that while the RES has been updated to move to 100%, there needs to be a focus going forward on how to make that transition as equitably as possible. And so looking at the study that just was released this week, actually from the department, reviewing that for the actions that could be appropriately implemented, understanding that not everything in the report itself will be agreed to by all stakeholders, but the overall intention of that act and the study that it required is to ensure that community level renewable energy programs are available, especially for low income Vermonters. And so keeping that as a priority here felt important, and I will stop there.
Great. And Liz, in terms of the bigger Excel, you have a number of other strategies and actions in that Excel, or you've boiled it all down to this?
There's a few things in there that aren't specifically reflected here, but and then there were some things that I remember Sam and perhaps some others of members of the task group had pointed out could also be added. Just bluntly, Rich can recharacterize if he prefers, but there wasn't a lot of appetite for taking on that additional work. I had hoped I'd be able to do some of it this week, but I've had other activities. So I don't know whether this task group will get that done in time for the council to look at, or whether it'll be a trailing item. But I believe the priorities are well set regardless, because we did build the priorities off of the Excel.
Thanks, Liz. Okay.
And
All right.
I just had a follow-up question on that one, David. I think, as I understand it, it's the any new actions that really need to go through the equity screening and the prioritization. So I can't remember, Liz, if you guys have new actions that you're contemplating, or if it really is kind of refining and continuing what was in the last cap.
Yeah, the answer for me was no. But if there are others on the task group who believe new actions should be needed, then that's something we could look through and do. But I don't think the task group as a whole had a set of proposed new actions at this point.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I'd be really reluctant to put them forward to the council without having cross-sector get that level of review.
Right. You wouldn't be the only subcommittee that's going to say to the council, we actually haven't totally finished the full Excel yet. So if that's where you get to on Friday, you will not be alone. I think other subcommittees, what they might do is say, here's our draft, but we haven't worked on it. So you could choose whether to advance something as a draft, or you just say, I don't have the full Excel for you right now. Okay. But on this stuff, yeah, Dave, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm a skunk at the garden party here, but I wanted to make some observations. I mean, I see, looking at these actions, create procurement and customer enrollment programs in action 3, that's an action. Seek state and federal source funding, that's an action. But continued PC oversight, that's not an action. That's just a noun clause. That's nothing. We're not conferring any more jurisdiction on the PUC, obviously. We're not proposing that. There's not a lot happening there. And I would expect, if we're going to articulate an action, that we should propose that something happens. That's my observation.
Right. So the starting an action by continue something raises a question. Should you start it with something that's more like do something? Right. Okay. I'd be interested to hear from the task group on that. TJ?
Yeah, and what I was going to say might be responsive to that anyway. I think the prioritization here with, and maybe it could be rephrased, but actions that start continued PUC oversight, and then the task group not getting to the spreadsheet really reflects the kind of sentiment that the real priorities are need to be in the transportation and thermal sector, and that the electric sector, this is on a path that needs to continue. And I want to caution against. I don't know that, Dave, you were quite saying this, but I want to caution against having actions and recommendations for having actions and recommendations' sake. That is not productive, and that gets us into trouble down the road. Like, it just creates like political footballs. It just like is a waste of money and resources. Like, if we have an action to recommend, we should recommend an action. If we don't need to prioritize it when it's very clearly for the cross-sector mitigation group with emissions mitigation as the core of what this subcommittee does. Those emissions are not in the electric sector. So it really is about keeping the electric system strong and affordable, enabling the other sectors to continue emissions reductions. And so I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks, TJ. Rich?
Well, some of what might be called actions are actually verbs in the strategy line. For example, deploy programs is an action to ensure that the grid supports electrification. Is the actual action, and the way it gets implemented is PUC oversight of utility programs, and perhaps getting additional funding. So yeah, we're not particularly consistent in where we put the verbs versus where we put the responsibility. But I'm echoing in a bit. I mean, I'm echoing both Liz and TJ on this, that it is really important for and it's good to emphasize that the job of the power system here is to support the electrification that is being driven in the other two sectors. And that includes through load management, adequate grid supports, and programs that help customers to deploy heat pumps and electric vehicles cost effectively. So,
okay. Yep.
I think it's here.
So yeah, and I wonder if there's something to be done to take some of the language out of the strategy and put it into like the way it's framed as an action. And I don't know, task group members, how you feel about that, but I could imagine, from the first strategy in the first piece of strategy in action, there's verbs like enable customable programs, blah, 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 right? Or as Rich said in the other one, deploy programs for the second one. So maybe there's some language just so the action feels a little more action-y. Like, this is what needs to happen. does that make sense to task group members as like literally use the same words, but just turning the actions into where the verbs are happening?
Yeah, I'm sure we could reorder and tighten some of it. I think I agree with TJ on this one, that I actually think it's important to just point out where appropriate that we have a mechanism for oversight and progress on something. So I view it as a good thing that the PUC has oversight on these areas already and can deepen that.
Thanks, Liz. Dave?
Of course, the PUC should have oversight. I'm not saying they shouldn't, suggesting that. It's just if we stand back, what we're talking about is a transition to the power, to the use of energy in this state, from fossil to electricity. And we should, despite having 100% clean electricity, we've all agreed on that, we should be identifying and making sure we're taking actions that are going to ensure the most efficient deployment of investment to make that transition. If we don't, it will cost more than it needs to. And many of us will feel that and be grumpy about it, but others of us will feel it and really be heavily affected by the lack of affordability. And so I think a greater focus on managing this transition in the electric sector, accommodating the changes that are going to come, I think it should be better articulated. That's why I made these comments.
Great. Dave, can I check with you real quick, though? The three pathways and the three sort of thrusts of this effort feel like can I check if those feel like the right three pathways?
Great categories. Sure.
Yeah.
No, I don't disagree with the pathways. I'm just saying what actions are we recommending happen? And I don't get a strong feel for actions, agents taking those actions, result. I just don't see it.
Okay. Even if we did some of what Rich said of taking some of the verbs and the actions that are kind of in the strategy language right now and making that into the more of action language?
Yeah, one would have to do that.
Okay. I would say let's do that. And I don't want to get into a conversation about how important this is. I think everybody believes it's important, right? So I don't need to go back and forth about levels of importance of doing demand management or looking for affordability, right? Or the kinds of things that are here. I just want to make sure we're expressing it in the clearest way possible about the things that you want to call people's attention to, the council, and then eventually everybody else. TJ, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of relative importance right now.
Yeah, no, I was actually just trying to, and then we could take this offline, it may be helpful, but the gap that you're trying to fill there, Dave, like I think what you're saying implies that we don't have the laws or regulations in place to ensure cost-effective operation of the grid. And so that's where I think I'm struggling is I don't know where the gap is that we're trying to fill.
No, I understand that, TJ. I hear the department and the administration pointing out every time they don't want to see upward pressure on rates, electricity rates for Vermonters. But I don't see the flip side of the pancake, concern for that, which is ensuring that the existing programs, the existing practices out there are going to avoid putting upward pressure on rates. And I think if we don't pay attention to those existing dynamics, but just focus on incremental changes, then we're missing an opportunity, especially when we start using electricity twice as much.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I just say in public here, we do that every day. We don't litigate it in the press like others do. So we do that. That's our day-to-day job. And I'm happy to connect with you and talk with you about exactly what the PUC and the Public Service Department do on the flip side of it. Just because it's not in the press does not mean that we're not doing it.
All right. So can we say that over the next 24 hours, we're going to do some word adjustments on this slide that try to get at this idea of action and the kinds of actions that are in the strategy statement more firmly expressed as an action? If folks are comfortable doing that, I wonder if I can just get some help. Your co-chairs can do that, but I think Liz and others who've been involved in the work should be involved in that. and Dave Farnsworth, if you feel strongly about it, encourage you to get involved in that as well. But that's something that could happen in the next 24 hours because it feels like we're getting in the right space. We just need to get the language. Okay. Liz, are you up for helping in that?
I may have time to help for sure, but I'm just going to lean on other task group members due to other deadlines, trying to multitask here. But if there are proposed ways to, as you put it, Dave, reorder words and, make it more action oriented, I'm sure all of us are happy to take a look.
Great. Okay. Folks who haven't spoken on this issue, anything else on electricity? If you haven't spoken up yet, anyone?
Let me just chime in on a process point here, which is that, Dave, I know you have a lot of responsibilities on the thermal side, so I don't want to lean on you. But if you want to collaborate with Liz, I would encourage, you two to get together. Okay.
Okay. Any folks, subcommittee members, before we finish up here on electricity? Okay. This is a great time to pause for public comment, indeed. And so would welcome folks if you've been listening in to the comments so far on electricity and transportation. Great time to chime in and do what Annette's doing, which is raise your hand. Annette, go ahead, please.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm not seeing captured in the recommendations is what's going on or needs to go on, and I think it relates to the equity part of it with the needed transmission and distribution upgrades. So for instance, if you look at the Green Mountain Power 2.0 solar map, you see all these areas in red. So I look at that and say, how is equitable electrification going to happen? And so if you're looking for an action item on electrification, I would put that sort of near the top of focusing on funding those sorts of needed distribution system upgrades. And I know there's, Velco's doing this long range transmission planning. The PUC's held a workshop on it. They're looking at more coordination between the Velco and the distribution utilities. And I just don't see any of that reflected in these recommendations. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate that. Anyone else who's joined us today would want to make a public comment? Sorry. I'm not seeing other hands of public comment, so why don't...
I can respond briefly to Annette, if that's okay.
Yes.
It may be part of the word salad problem we talked about earlier, Annette, but it was intended by the task group for the phrases targeted siting of generation, and then later in the action, consideration of regulatory approval improvements for efficient generation and infrastructure siting, for those two things to go toward what you're talking about. In other words, recognizing that, and that's in the first pathway, not the third. In the third pathway, there's phraseology regarding approval for community-based, how approval for community-based project siting occurs. But I did want to let you know, we did talk about the issue that you raised and intended for those concepts to be included through that.
Right. So I was just noticing that it probably belongs in the equitable second bullet too, and it's not there.
I hear you. Okay. Thanks for the input.
Great. All right, well, let's continue on to buildings and thermal. And whoever is going to lead us through that work.
David, there's a comment about public comment on this transportation part.
Yeah, and so that public comment was absolutely, period, was for both of those, transportation and electricity. So feel free, yeah, that was. Okay. All right. Buildings and thermal, take it away. The presentation looks a little different than, say, the first one. You can tell us how you're going to walk us through priority actions or how you're going to walk us through the overall scope of pathways. Who's going to take the lead on this?
I assume Melissa was doing this.
I was assuming Dave was, but I can certainly step up if you want me to run through these. So buildings and thermal, we had some homework after the last meeting, but as an overview of our pathways and strategies, and then we'll get to the priorities. The first is essentially an overarching sectoral policy that covers emissions reductions, and there's essentially two proposals at play, just given the complexity of the timing around the disposition of the clean heat standard. So this is kind of an either or, either continue with the clean heat standard or potentially in a modified form, or use the cap and invest program as the overarching policy for the thermal sector, potentially coupled with transportation and other sectors. So we can move along on the slides. So in terms of priority actions for this pathway, again, it's that we need an overarching policy in the sector to help ensure compliance with GWSA. And pathway 2 deals with reducing emissions from buildings. And this is a sampling of strategies under that pathway. But we can skip ahead to the next slide because we're really trying to focus on priority actions here. So within the buildings portion of buildings and thermal, the priority, as discussed last time, this one has not changed from the presentation last week, is highlighting weatherization as a real key need and scaling up weatherization efforts. And along with that, recommending a commensurate funding source, either through fuel gross receipts tax or a thermal energy benefits charge at a fairly modest level to essentially achieve emissions reductions in the thermal sector in the shorter term, while an overarching policy is potentially advanced in the coming years. So we see this as a more short-term action. All right. So our other pathways here, you see pathway 3 and pathway 4. These both deal with equipment. So again, buildings and thermal has talked about buildings, equipment, and fuels as subsectors within the sector. So this one, I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking today with the subcommittee. We have potentially 2 priorities under consideration. The first here has to do with setting equipment standards, essentially to mandate more efficient or zero emitting equipment in the future. And the reason this is TBD is because we have a couple of options that we're exploring and still refining wording on that recommendation. Essentially, the task group's been meeting this week and is evaluating the potential to recommend a study of equipment standards rather than a previous iteration of this priority slide deck included essentially recommending adoption of appliance standards. So the task group is still wrestling with that recommendation. And then pathway 4 is again speaks to beneficial electrification of existing space and water heating and enhances equity. And so the strategy there would be, again, around providing funding for beneficial electrification, specifically targeted to low and moderate income households. So here are the priority, this is our placeholder for the priority actions related to equipment, still wording TBD, but conceptually, we want to prioritize movement towards adoption of an equipment standard. The timeline that we have talked about at the task group is a standard that would take effect around 2030. And just laying the groundwork, making sure that that we evaluate all of the implications of doing that, look at market readiness, look at costs and benefits to different demographics, and essentially set the stage for adoption down the road, which would potentially happen after the next iteration of the climate action plan is released. So again, you'll see conceptually, pursue equipment standards. That's a more long-term policy recommendation, and provide funding for heating electrification is a more short-term recommendation. And some of the conversations we've had at the task group level, again, is like helping make sure Vermonters feel comfortable and confident that they will have assistance in doing this transition to zero emissions heating equipment in their homes, and that there will be adequate support. And that's based on some of the public comment that we've gotten kind of throughout the fall. And then the fifth pathway, so we basically have a priority recommendation for each of our pathways. And this is similar to transportation, exploring or adopting a clean fuel standard. And I might have to rely on some of my other task group members if there's more to say on this one. This is also potentially embedded within a revised clean heat standard.
I think that's got it.
Okay. So that's our priority action for the fuels subsector. So we have a bunch of folks from buildings and thermal on. Anybody want to supplement what I've ineloquently presented?
Thanks, Melissa. I would go back to the very first slide, I think. Pathway 1. Yeah. As we discussed last time, the key, I'd say policy thrust of the overarching sector-wide mechanism that we want isn't that it's market-based, but rather that it's sector-wide and addresses a number of implementation pathways. And so just in order to be more, clear about why we're recommending an overarching strategy, I would propose language like the following. Reduce GHG emissions from the RCI sector through a broad sector-wide mechanism to flexibly reduce emissions through a range of end-use actions across buildings, fuels, and equipment. And because that's really what it's about. It's not, gee, we want to create a market. It's more like we want to create an overarching mechanism that both ensures a predictable emission reduction pathway and also allows actions to occur and supports actions occurring in those three buckets that we've otherwise identified.
Can you say that phrase one more time, Rich? Sorry.
Yeah. Through a broad sector-wide mechanism, flexibly reduce thermal sector emissions through a range of end-use actions across buildings, fuels, and equipment.
Okay, thanks.
And then, the strategy, next following is adopt at least one such mechanism, or one broad-based mechanism.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And that's very consistent with the notes from last meeting too, where you're trying to tease out what that thing is, and market-based isn't nailing it in terms of saying what it is you're looking for.
Yeah, that's not the key. It's true that there are some market-based mechanisms used in these techniques, but It's if you think about cap and invest, it's not, you know, the carbon market that's driving the change. It's the investments, and the investments need to be strategically targeted. So that's just an example.
Thanks, Rich. Jared?
Thanks. Yeah. On this point, I just want to say I agree with Rich's suggested changes, and I also think that they do reflect kind of where we ended up in our conversation last time as a subcommittee. And I really want to thank Melissa for doing a great job providing an overview of the pathways and recommended actions. I have a different interpretation of the second recommended action as it would relate to the potential role of the fuel gross receipts tax or a thermal energy benefits charge. I believe that what that was, correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, and this could just be a difference of how different members of the task group understood it, but I just want to share how I understood it because it's a little bit different than I heard you say. I think I heard you say, Melissa, that the goal there is to implement one of those so that we could make sector-wide investments sooner than might happen via a cap and invest or a modified clean heat standard strategy. I had understood.
Can I pause you for 1 second, Jared? Where are you? What slide are you on?
Oh, sorry. Pathway 2. It's on the buildings. Yep, right there. So this is the recommendation, and you can actually go forward one more slide, I believe, to the action, the priority recommendation action. Yes. So as I understood it, this is really about focusing funds dedicated to weatherization, especially for low and moderate income households. I think it's debatable that trying to get additional funds via the fuel gross receipts tax or from a thermal energy benefits charge could happen on a timeline that would be any faster than potentially a revised clean heat standard or a cap and invest program. So the key difference to me on this one isn't the timing of it, but it's that it would be either of those sources would be dedicated sources to the win-win-win strategy from an emissions reduction, health benefits, and equity standpoint of further investments in low and moderate income weatherization. So I just wanted to
dedicated funding. Yeah, that's the key move here you're looking for is dedicated funding for weatherization with an emphasis on low and moderate income.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Other folks feel that? Yeah, go ahead.
No, thanks for the clarification, Jared. I mean, I think from my perspective, I'd like to see that happen sooner than 2030. And I'd love for the council to make it, and I'd love for the council to make a strong statement that needs to happen before an overarching policy can be. I mean, you know, we could all talk about the politics of feasibility of implementing taxes, fees at any point, but I think timing is one of the rationales under which I would support this recommendation.
I agree that I very much hope it happens before 2030. I also very much hope that our priority overarching recommendation, as just described by Rich, happens well before 2030.
Okay. So the edit here, though, is to get in this language of the priority action, the idea of dedicated funding for weatherization with an emphasis on low and moderate income, and that is achieved in a timely fashion. And whether that comes from these sources or some other sources, I guess what you're saying, Jared.
I think it's already there. I just didn't want to lose that this was really about a focused, dedicated source for weatherization, especially for low and moderate income households. I mean, we can tighten it a little more if we want, but I think it is already there.
Okay, great. Rich?
Two things. I fully agree with the idea that we should be pushing for early action on this recommendation. Second, early action isn't going to do it by itself, because we are going to need dedicated. It would be lovely to think that we're going to get a cap and invest or a clean heat standard overarching policy that would make this recommendation less important in the future because the funding source is going to come from the overarching policy. But I wouldn't want us to suggest that this is just a stopgap between now and then. That's one point. Second point is that elsewhere, and we just discussed it with the electricity recommendations, we recognize that we need funding not just for weatherization, but for beneficial electrification. And again, targeted as much as possible to low and moderate income households. So that the idea that a thermal energy benefits charge would only go to building shells and not also to heat pumps or the like, advanced wood heat, whatever, would be wrong. I think we need to somehow reflect that even though weatherization is our top priority, a thermal energy benefits charge is going to be needed to support electrification as well.
Okay. I'm not quite sure how that shows up in an edit, Rich. So I'm trying to really be extra super clear, like what needs to be edited to get over the finish line for tomorrow.
Well,
Jared and then Liz. Sorry. Well, go ahead, Rich. Yeah.
Just quickly, I mean, we have created buckets: buildings, equipment, and fuels.
Yeah.
So I'm perfectly fine with saying within buildings we need the benefits charge. That's fine, so long as we don't forget that we're going to need revenue for the other two things too.
Got it. Thanks. Jared?
So I agree with what Rich is saying, and I think that there are a number of programs that have been developed of late and funding sources that have been committed to make sure that, you know, there's an efficiency of if Vermonters are being served with weatherization services, and at that same time we can help them save money and cut pollution by changing their water heater, you know, from a propane water heater to a heat pump water heater, or, you know, upgrade their heating system to something that's going to be lower cost, more price stable, and less polluting, then we should be doing those things at the same time. So there's a little bit of a balance here, because this is the building sector recommendation, so it makes sense to focus on weatherization. But I agree with Rich that we wouldn't want to suggest that new funding sources, regardless of their source, should only be used in that way, because I think we would want to continue that kind of flexible, more holistic approach of when there are service providers in the homes of Vermonters helping them weatherize, we also want to be able to make investments in other kind of beneficial and clean heating technologies. So I don't know whether we say that here or elsewhere, but I think it is an important point that we don't want to be too kind of narrow and limited about just weatherization, when there are complementary things that often go along with weatherization that can further increase the benefits.
That's great. And I think one thing that's hard right now is we can't see these priorities on the same page. So it's hard to like look across and like, is it all there? Like, is it all funded? Liz, jump in, and then I really want to push people towards what are specific edits that you would suggest in this, and what you've seen. If we need to go back and forth between slides, let's do it. Liz?
I commend you for moving us along and getting it done, and I understand the need to do that. And I would put on the table a request that our subcommittee consider putting the cross back in cross sector, and that even though we finish this task today that is bucketed as we've worked, that we ask the Climate Council as a whole for the follow-up to our cross sector subcommittee to be coming back with a unified, holistic set of priority actions rather than this bucketed approach. Not for tomorrow, not for the next meeting, but as the request coming out of that meeting to take the work that we've done and actually make it cross sector. I just don't feel that we're getting that, and I don't think it serves any part of the way I'm thinking of it. It doesn't serve Vermonters, it doesn't serve our GWSA goals, it doesn't really serve the council in terms of the climate action plan we have to create in order to do that all, I think we need to really get together and make a much more holistic set of priorities.
Yeah. And I feel like you're not far, right? I feel like if you sit with it and look at it.
You're good at moving us along, and I appreciate that. I'm sure you're right that we're not too far. But this discussion, I mean, Rich is 100% correct that, you know, if we focus only on weatherization, we are missing a major opportunity. That was made clear in the last climate action plan. We worked really hard to make sure that it said weatherization and electrification, and it supported things like panel upgrades and service upgrades that customers sometimes have to pay for themselves. Anyway, we can do it. We just haven't done it yet. We need to, in my opinion.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah. Christine?
I think building on Liz's observation and very astute comments just now, I'd like to suggest that cross-sector consider messaging to the council as part of the next presentation to the council that we recognize we're almost there to elevating our individual sector priorities, strategies, and actions with a cross-sector viewpoint, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. And I would suggest we consider offering to the council that once we get their initial feedback from our soon presentation to them, that we then both take their feedback and challenge ourselves to suggest to them for our next presentation to them, presentation 2 from now, their feedback plus our thinking so far with the cross-sector point of view already packaged together for their consideration. I think we are well positioned to do that, perhaps better positioned to do that, having come into this, you know, at the minutia level and now working to, you know, roll it up for a presentation to the council, but perhaps others feel differently.
Sounds great. And I think cross-sector, unlike other subcommittees, has ongoing work related to studies like the Cap and Invest study, for instance, or the business as usual and the, you know, the analysis around that. So I think there is some ongoing work here. And I think expressing what you all have just said, what Christine and Liz said, expressing that to the council will be important. Okay. And in that context, I do want to encourage folks to think a little bit about what's coming out of buildings here and the fact that there's a question mark that seems like you all meet tomorrow. And I wonder if this subcommittee wants to, like, I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. Like, the task group will meet tomorrow and then that ends up in the presentation and off you go. I mean, how do you want to feel comfortable as a subcommittee with the results of that call tomorrow? It seems somewhat consequential about how you come down on that particular issue. Rich?
Well, I'm hearing there may be 3 things. And the first is to follow up and perhaps if the rest of the committee agrees with Christine's and Liz's point that we need to tell the council that we see some opportunities here for you know, more integration in a cross-sector way across some of these policies, and that we're okay to take that on. That's one point. The second point is a smaller one, which is that the idea of a funding source, for example, a thermal energy benefit charge, is relevant to at least 2 of our internal sectors inside thermal. And we should just repeat it by putting it in both places. And the third point is that as far as what we should try to accomplish tomorrow, I think it may be that pretty much all we can accomplish tomorrow is to hash out how we want to address equipment standards. And I wouldn't try to go solve these other problems right now.
Yeah.
And finally, it's true that cross-sector says cross-sector, but there's at least two interpretations of that. And one is that we're only looking, we have to find threads that cut through everything in order for it to be a cross-sector policy. And the other is to say, no, we just need to, we're looking across all the sectors and with regard to emission reduction potential, and we may have different policies inside those buckets. They don't all necessarily have to be a thread that connects all the beads.
Right. Okay. Other subcommittee members maybe have been a little quieter this time. Folks who haven't weighed in as much. How you feeling about these conversations, both buildings and thermal, but this broader conversation about where you're at as a subcommittee and the work still ahead of you? Folks who haven't chimed in as much today on the subcommittee, thoughts? Joey?
I guess I would just say welcome to look forward to hearing where y'all land tomorrow in the thermal space. And to Liz's point, and underscored by Christine and Rich, I definitely would be open to consider thinking about what that looks like. I get that there are two interpretations of cross-sector, but these are all interrelated as we look to electrify more. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but asking for a little room to help us help make this easier and interconnected for policymakers, the public, whatever. I'm open to exploring how we can do that because I agree that's real.
Yeah.
Thanks for raising.
Thanks, Joey. Okay. Anything else in the buildings and thermal? If folks, maybe you want to flip through the slides for a second because we don't all have it on one slide. So, you know, we have 5 pathways, right? And for each pathway, a recommended action, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
We might have 6 pathways, but
5 that are mentioned here.
yes, 5 that have priorities associated.
Okay. Just to be Rich, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize for stating what I hope is the obvious. One obvious point that we could make and probably should in our presentations is that the high level, you know, sector-wide policies that we're talking about, cap and invest and clean heat standard, are themselves designed to stitch across all the buckets that we've been discussing. And so, you know, we have, as a subcommittee, including in the last plan, we've been pretty consciously looking for policies that do connect the dots.
And when you have a presentation on Monday that does the whole thing, right? All your subgroups together in a common format and things, you'll be able to look across, and that'll be a great input for the additional conversation you want to have about the stitching and the threading. Okay. There was one little thing that I just want to make sure everybody's saw it in the same way I saw it. If you look at your very first buildings and thermal recommendation, it's prefaced by saying through legislative or administrative action. I just want to make sure that everyone saw that and is clear about what that means.
Thanks, David, for raising that. I don't think we have a clear understanding of what that means. And I lean towards, I'd like to get input from the subcommittee. From my perspective on the Buildings and Thermal Task Group, I've conveyed that I'd explicitly not support implementing the clean heat standard via rule if it is voted down ultimately in the legislature. And so I would like to hear from other subcommittee members around the approach of essentially forcing administrative action in the absence of legislative action.
Thanks, Melissa. That's better said than I. Dave?
So that language is put in there to provide flexibility, obviously. We're not proposing the clean heat standard. We're proposing a modified clean heat standard, significantly modified, right? It's one that may not necessarily do all the work that's required by the targets set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. It may only do some of them, in which case complementary policies are going to have to pick up more for us to meet those goals. So would the legislature, one path is for the PUC to continue doing what it's doing, for the legislature to review, and whatever happens politically, the governor to thumbs up, thumbs down on that. Or another path would be for the legislature to consider a modified clean heat standard and to support that. And I don't really have a feel for the politics one way or the other, but there's a path there. There's also the possibility of an administrative action, which is to undertake some parts of the clean heat standard as we know it, and going ahead with authority to regulate air pollution, for example, that ANR has. I'm speculating a little bit here, but the point of having an administrative or legislative path is to accommodate those variations that we're not entirely clear on here.
Okay. Jared?
My perspective on this is broadly similar to Dave's. I would note that it's in 1.1.2 as well, this phrase through legislative or administrative action. I think it was clear in our task group deliberations that maybe different task group members had themselves and were aware that others had different perspectives and opinions on what could or should happen through administrative action versus what could or should happen through legislative action. And rather than try to settle all of that in the task group, make it clear that we want to leave open the flexibility that many of these things could happen through either legislative or administrative action. You know, on the second one, there are states that have set emissions cap programs through their equivalent of ANR under their existing authority. So we wouldn't want to say that couldn't happen. So this to me is about leaving open pathways and providing flexibility, especially in areas where it's, you know, not currently absolutely certain the exact pathway or authority.
I'm on mute. Would it be helpful, given the implications of some of these things, to write a sentence about the intent of leaving open pathways and possibilities as opposed to an intent of requiring rulemaking, if that's what your intent is?
Well, I don't think it's quite that simple, because if administrative or legislative action does not happen, then the only way to achieve legal obligations does become administrative action. So I don't think it's fair to say that should not be contemplated, because it's exactly what's contemplated by the Global Warming Solutions Act, and our job is to put together a plan that adds up to meeting those obligations.
I guess I just want to say that we should be as explicit as we can at the subcommittee level, and if there's disagreement, then we should raise that to the council. Sorry, Christine, if you had your hand up, I didn't mean to jump in. And I just don't want to try to be tricky here with rulemaking. If the council wants a rule to be adopted right within 1 year of the update to the cap, as I understand it, that is the provision within GWSA. I think we need to be explicit about it. And I don't know what it means to put in the climate action plan through administrative action, something will happen. Does that trigger the rulemaking provision or not? And I want to make sure we're not trying to be tricky or fancy here and that we're being explicit about the intent. We won't know the disposition of the clean heat standard until right before the climate action plan is adopted. So we don't have the luxury of having that certainty. So if legislative action on clean heat isn't taken, I think we need to understand what the Climate Council is recommending regarding an overarching policy in the thermal sector.
Christine, do you want to jump in on this?
I guess I have a question, and maybe I'm having a brain freeze, but if we have legislation that makes it a legal requirement to achieve emissions reductions, and we don't have legislative action needed to do that, is there any other recourse other than administrative action instead?
I think what's at stake for you all as a climate council is the recommendations you're making, right, to a variety of actors. And then you have a specific possibility of triggering rulemaking. And so if in this climate action plan, you are specifically trying to, or some of you are explicitly trying to trigger rulemaking, like Melissa says, you may need to be more explicit. And there may be a variety of views on that in this subcommittee and on the council, right? So I think that's what's at stake here. So I think that's why we're having the conversation. Dave, Jared?
I just want to reiterate, David, there are different paths for this to occur, and that's why we wanted to leave open the recognition that this could happen legislatively or through administrative action. I don't know, it's to me, it seems like very simple as far as recognizing the many paths. Which one's going to actually occur? Not so easy, right? That's not easy to figure out. But recognizing up front this could happen different ways, I think, is the responsible thing to do. That's what we've tried to do in articulating this statement.
Okay. Jared and then Matt.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with everything that Dave just said. I think that what we are trying to do here is no more, no less, provide the flexibility to do what we've been charged with, which is design technologically feasible, cost-effective ways to meet our responsibility to cut climate pollution. That it comes in two forms here. It says at least one of these, so it's not prescriptive about modified clean heat. It includes joining a cap and invest to cover RCI fuels. And it's also not prescriptive about whether that has to happen legislatively or by administrative action, because we can't predict the future about what will happen in either of those venues. So I think it's important that we retain that flexibility. If we become too prescriptive or try to predict the future, I think that we end up in a situation potentially like last time where we had all our eggs in one basket, and then including TCI in the transportation sector, that fell apart, and we didn't have an ability to move forward because we had not baked in some of these other options and provided the flexibility for how to move forward in the way that we have here.
Okay. Matt?
Oh, I just didn't know, I'm new to this game. Didn't know if there was a recognition that there are limitations on what can occur regulatorily through administrative action. Certainly, you could never possibly pass a fine or a fee on fossil fuels or a tax. That has to happen through the legislature.
Right. Right. I mean, what I'm taking away from this is if the intent is to say there are multiple pathways for this to happen, these are the multiple pathways, both in terms of the types of policy, cap and invest, a modified clean heat, and the pathways to get those done, some version of administrative legislative action, right? Then let's be clear about that sort of flexibility aspect that you're trying to express with this, as opposed to, you know, a directional aspect of we want it to go this way. Matt?
What is meant by a modified CHS?
I think that's a really I'm glad you brought that up, because in the last meeting, there was a request that we put on the slide more description of what that is. And so I wonder if it's possible for this action, priority action in particular, that there's just a little bit more detail that explains, since it's such a sensitive issue. Dave, did you want to do that?
Well, yeah, I think what we're talking about with respect to a modified clean heat standard is one that wouldn't be imposed in one fell swoop. It would be implemented in a gradual fashion, incrementally. It's one that would contain an explicit cost cap. Notice there have been discussions in the technical advisory group and the rulemaking that's taken place at the PUC about just adopting a price. There's a mechanism for adopting a price, setting a price, but nobody's adopting a price. This recommendation would say, look, adopt a price, would be your effective cost cap. And that would be a start to a program. So it's not the clean heat standard as proposed, but it's one that would start wherever it starts, but be available to scale up. It would start sooner than later, and it would have an explicit cost cap as part of it. Others may have additional things in mind, but that's what we tried to capture here on the slide.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, Matt, I think the intent there was the cost analysis around clean heat standard has shown that like reaching the 2030 GWSA emissions reduction requirement is driving a lot of the costs associated with that policy. And so this is a recognition that if you take away that requirement, that the PUC set requirements to meet the 2030 emissions reduction requirement, you potentially have the ability to be more flexible around those costs by instituting a cost cap or something else, the way Dave just articulated.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else on buildings and thermal?
I apologize. I do want to just say briefly in passing, and I don't know if we want to change the language here now, that I do think it's important just for the clear language about what we're talking about and what we mean by this recommendation, that be called a price cap rather than a cost cap. Because what happens is when you set a price cap on a clean heat credit, it is also reducing the funds that are available to help low and middle income Vermonters access clean heat. So it's also, if you call it a cost cap, it would also be a benefit cap, because the revenue from clean heat credits is what funds the activity that was designed to be progressively serving low and middle income Vermonters to access weatherization, heat pumps, et cetera. So I think cost cap to me feels a little imbalanced because it's not recognizing that such a thing would also be a benefit cap on the other side of what you do with that clean heat revenue. So I think it would be more accurately called a price cap on the clean heat credits rather than a cost cap. Cost cap sounds to me as kind of putting our finger on the scale of a way that this is being framed politically that I think is incomplete.
Okay. Everybody okay with that? Okay, great. All right, so I want to break for public comment, and then I want to circle back and just be real clear on the tasks over the next 24 hours to get this into place. You're comfortable bringing it up to the council. And so let's do public comment, and then let's make sure we're really clear on the next steps to get this at least to December 16th, and then the next steps you've all talked about for you as a subcommittee. Annette, go ahead.
Yeah, what Jared just said clarified a little bit for me, what was not clear from this language about what a modified clean heat standard means, because it seemed like it was looking at perhaps some sort of a tax on emissions or tax on fuel, but if a modified clean heat standard still includes this very complicated credit system, I don't see that's being realistic. I mean, I've been attending the technical advisory group meetings and a lot of the other meetings that are being held on the clean heat standard, and it is so incredibly complicated. And if I want to warn you about backlash. I mean, that's the world in which I live. I watch what gets proposed and I see the reactions to it. And if you're going to be recommending a modified clean heat standard, then I think you need to be very clear in this language that that still includes a credit system that has to be built from the ground up. And Vermont is going to have to expend a lot of money to get a system like that in place. The other thing I want to comment on is the work that's going to happen tomorrow outside of public view regarding the appliance standards. So I've had a little bit of time to investigate a little bit further of my own needs, and also I was thinking about Jared's response to what I said last week. I'm reminded of a public comment I made, I think, more than 2 years ago to this subcommittee, which was to please be realistic. And so if you are going to be looking at an appliance standard that everything has to be zero emissions, I like the idea of a study to look and see what's out there, because it looks to me like this is all about everybody has to use electricity. And there you go, putting all your eggs in one basket again. I did find out that for my situation, I have one choice, and it's to buy the same unit that I bought in 1995. I did get it fixed. The technician happened to go to the dump the day that you guys met, and he saw that somebody had dumped one of them, and he was able to scavenge the part and get it right in. The only other option I have is to get something that requires electricity. Similarly, with an oil burner that requires electricity. Now, the idea that I'm off grid and therefore I'm, entitled to some sort of waiver under what you guys are looking at, that doesn't cut it, because although I'm off grid, there are many, many Vermonters who are connected to the grid, who use propane for a heat source, who, for whatever reasons, we've heard that 30% of homes are appropriate for heat pumps. That leaves a lot of homes that, people have said to me, I've looked at getting a heat pump. My house has all these little rooms. There's no way. Even people with money don't find that it's cost effective to do. So sure, do a study. And my final comment is something I said over 2 years ago. Please do not exclude, please include solar hot water. Solar hot water works in Vermont. We need to be adding that. It did get added to the clean heat standard list of clean heat measures. I also installed, as part of my solar hot water heat system, I have a heating system that's solar, not just for domestic hot water, but for actual heat. And it was an interesting experiment. It works maybe, I don't know, 7 days out of the year. It works in spring and fall. You have to have an interesting combination of sunshine and but still, this idea that everybody is going to electrify is not realistic given the state of technology. So let's use the technologies that work. Solar hot water works for domestic hot water a lot of the time. I would say 90% of the time, but you have to have some sort of propane backup. Same thing would be true for a heat pump. You still have to have some sort of fossil backup unless you have a well-insulated new build. So just please don't do things that are going to cause a backlash from Vermonters, that are going to cause them to react. That's what I worry about when I see things like the language like modified clean heat standard. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate the input. Anyone else who's been listening into the meeting who want to comment on the discussions? Okay. Should we talk about next steps? I don't have the agenda right in front of me. Was there something else we were supposed to do besides next steps?
No, I think we can merge. Yeah, I'm fine.
Great. Co-chairs, you know, what I'm hearing is, you know, I've taken some notes as I did last time, you know, some specific changes. I can send those around in a kind of messy form. It sounds like transportation, we almost did it in real time. I don't know. I feel like, Melissa, you were doing it in real time, maybe even, but there's a few little tweaks on the transportation slides. Electricity, in an ideal scenario, a couple of you get together and do some of that wording changes to sort of tease out those actions a little bit more clearly that are already in there. And buildings and thermal, and by the way, also I'll just note on electricity, there was that comment about distribution and whether that needs to be more visible. I'll put that out there. Buildings and thermal, we talked about some ways to change the language in the pathway 1 priority action. And so we have some notes around that. And then there's a conversation tomorrow. And I guess this is an opportunity for anyone who's not going to be involved in that conversation tomorrow to provide some input to the group about, you know, your sort of vision about how that should land or could land. And then all this needs to be consolidated tomorrow afternoon and sent over to the council. And to the extent your Excels are done, great. To the extent they're not, you know, ask for forgiveness. And then you also had some clear statements that you want to make to the council about your next steps, and particularly around looking across all of your actions and taking that cross-sector look and see what comes from that conversation. All right, I'll stop talking. Rich, does that align with what you're seeing?
Yeah, it does. I thought it would be useful to give the council members who aren't going to participate in tomorrow's conversation, and perhaps also any members of the public who are listening in, about like, what is it that we think we're headed towards? And a quick version of that, I think, is that we are going to be discussing a recommendation concerning equipment standards, and in particular, how quickly we should launch a study, which we think could be launched in the summer of 2025, and what that study would look at, which would include, as I think Melissa alluded to this earlier, maybe it was Dave, could include the state of the market, what technologies are available, how much they cost. Are other states going to be pursuing similar standards? You know, and whether, because I'm pretty sure we don't want to go it alone on equipment standards, and the like, and as opposed to a hard recommendation that we adopt such a standard before such a study would be conducted. We may also make an observation in that the pathway and pace for water heaters might very well be able to be more quick than the pathway for space heating. And so acknowledging all those things in the discussion tomorrow is where I think we're headed. So comments on any of that from anybody before we depart today would be welcome.
Particularly subcommittee members who aren't going to be there. You know, I think you heard loud and clear from Annette, from a public comment standpoint, of her views on this, so that's helpful. But subcommittee members, okay, that's fine. All right, so Melissa and Rich, can you be like driving this ship for the next 24 hours to make sure this stuff comes together in a common format, so you're able to show this as a common, set of recommendations coming out of your subcommittee?
Yeah, I think we have some time tomorrow to pull the presentation together, and I agree, David, that we're probably pretty close to there in terms of consensus recommendations in transportation and electric sector, and we'll see where we sit coming out of the buildings and thermal meeting in the morning, and if there aren't consensus issues, we'll raise that, highlight that to the council.
Anything else? Encourage folks to listen in on the council meeting on Monday as this content is offered up, and there's any discussion we have with the council about it. Be very interesting to hear what the council says. All right. Anything else, folks? All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks for the hard work again.
Sorry, David, one last thing. And Rich and I haven't talked about this, I would be inclined to not meet as a subcommittee next week, and take the temperature of the room on that. And David, I don't think that we'd be getting any immediate feedback from the council that we would need to respond to next week.
I think a break is warranted.
Thank you, Andrew.
And if we did get immediate feedback, it would be nice to incorporate it in a way in which we could continue the momentum rather than having that get interrupted by the holiday break. So incorporating that feedback and picking back up as necessary in the new year, I would support that as well.
Okay, thanks all. So we'll have Brian remove that calendar invite for next week.
Great. All right, folks.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.